And today we turn the page on priestly regulations and the applications of purity and sacrifice on our national life. We leap from the world of laws, that is Leviticus, straight into the desert, into the Midbar, and this new chapter, this fourth installment of the 5 books of Moses, could barely be more different to the law. Though Vayikra includes a couple of dramatic feuds resulting in the tragic deaths of Nadab and Avihu and the stoning of the blasphemer, Bamidbar is suffused with commotion. We have jealousies and familial insurrections. We have mutinies and pervasive disaffections. We have the story of the spies and the assaults of a foreign prophet. We have talking donkeys and consanguineal gossip. We have page after page after page alive with the pressures and affairs of zealots and rebels and aspiring heirs. We have the death of a reprobate, the fall of a renegade, and the indiscretion of Moshe, our saint, and the passing of a whole generation that makes this book, the book of Bamidbar, the one with the highest concentration of drama. Aviva Zunberg, a contemporary teacher of Tanakh in Yerushalayim, in her latest work on Chumash, traces the emotive range of Bamidbar in her book Bewilderment. She covers grief and bereavement, identity and desire, the disillusionment and tensions that lead people to conspire and protest. She encapsulates the spirit of conflict that flickers in this text in a chapter that she calls Madness and Civilization. And yet, for all the pathos and all the chaos, Bamidbar's opening chapters appear on the surface to misrepresent the force of what follows. We begin with a directory of names and ages and data, which appears to merely recapitulate a sentence and a census that was taken just a year earlier. We're told, Se'u et Rosh Koladat B'nai Israel, count the heads of all the congregation of the children of Israel. And this is my question. Why does this book, the book of Bamidbar, which is defined by change and danger, begin with a repetition of a count that has already been conducted? Back in Kitisa, at the foot of Mount Sinai, in the wake of our ancestors' betrayal and failure, they were tallied. And nothing beyond the losses of Nadav and Avihu and the blasphemer appears to warrant a recount, and even my rudimentary arithmetic can perform the simple subtraction of 3. Why do we need to repeat a census already taken and weigh this book down with numbers that we already know? And Umberto Cassuto, also known as Moshe David Cassuto to his friends, a Florentine rabbi and biblical scholar, suggested that the reckoning here was not in fact repeated, but merely completed. He says the tallying of 603,550 people in the ancient world was no simple feat. The opening of Bamidbar does not in fact weigh down the text or the reader with a new set of numbers, but the claim that the census had at long last come to an end. But Dr. Cassuto is alone in this interesting assessment, as our traditional commentators and sages see the census, despite its length, as entirely new. And there are 2 answers, very briefly, as to why this extra census was commissioned that I want to share with you this Erev Shabbat this afternoon. And we begin, as we often do, with our foremost commentator, with Rashi, who, citing the sages, as he often does, suggests that there was no technical necessity for this new census. I don't know about you, I've just filled in my 2020 decennial US Census. I'm sure you've been getting letters through your door. It was really meant to be filled in by April the 1st, I think. But I filled it in last week, forgive me. And that count, that census every 10 years is mandated by Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution. And while at times a census may feel invasive, the framers of the Constitution enshrined it in law for a whole host of practical purposes. The results of that census will determine the number of seats that each state has in the U.S. House of Representatives, and it is used to distribute hundreds of billions of dollars in federal funds to local communities. The results of the U.S. Census help determine where to build everything from schools to supermarkets and homes to hospitals. And in other words, knowing our number is key to the equitable distribution of services and the preservation of an honest democracy. But here, in Bamidbar, in the eyes of Rashi, the tallying of souls was for an entirely different purpose. He says, Mitochi batam, out of love, moneh otam kol sha'ah. God counted the Jewish people all the time. The census was not about the distribution of services or the equitable representation. It was an unmitigated act of affection. Simone Weil, the Jewish-born French philosopher and activist, once wrote that attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. And here, despite already knowing our number, God asked that the leader of his people bequeath just a moment, rapt attention to each and every soul. In the words of Nachmanides the Ramban, each person came before the father of prophets, Moses, va'achiv kadosh Hashem, and his holy brother. And he would be known to them by name. The kind of compulsive attention that Gollum gives to his precious in The Lord of the Rings, the kind of obsessive devotion the Ebenezer Scrooge exhibits by repeatedly counting his money, is here transformed into an ethic of care, as the center of attention is not wealth or gems or trinkets, but people. Thus, the book of Bamidbar for Rashi begins with a gesture of celestial affection to each and every soul. But now we move to our second answer, the grandson of Rashi the Rashbam. And he sees this overture as less an act of heavenly benevolence in the present and more about a strategic preparation for the future. The count now, the census at the opening of our book, is nothing to do with tender attention for the Rashbam and everything to do with what lay on the horizon. Me'ata, from this moment, he says, Tzrichim lavo la'aretz, they were preparing to enter the land, u'letzeit b'tzavah ha'milchama, and go to war. So despite the profundity of arithmetic affection, this census for the Rashbam is far more strategic in nature, far more pragmatic and fixated on ensuring tactical military sense. And that is why, enshrined in the instruction to count, God says to Moshe, count kol yotzei sava, all those who can go to war. And that is why each of the 12 times that a tribe's totals are tallied, the number concludes with the statement, kol yotzei sava, all who are able to go to war. The count at the foot of Mount Sinai served the purpose of a national awakening, unveiling how a family of 70 men and women and children had grown into the basis of a world civilization. But this count at this juncture was not about the past or the present, but about the future and preparing for what lay ahead. And read this way, the census with which Bamidbar commences serves as a perfect pivot into the evolving narrative of our ancestors. At a fundamental level, while Vayikra is the book of law that sits in the middle, the books of Shemot and Bamidbar are about two distinct and radically different kinds of journeys. In the words of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Shemot is about a journey from, and Bamidbar is about a journey to. And this census at the start of our parsha marks the transition between the two. In Shemot, we read of a people fleeing an oppressor. They are pushed by the hand of God and the will to freedom to escape the clutches of an evil regime. But by the time that we get to Bamidbar, the physiological memories of Egypt are a year in the past. They have since heard the voice of God, accepted his covenant, and built his Mishkan. They are no longer a mass of slaves, but a nascent nation. They are no longer pushed by a nightmare to flee, but pulled by a dream to march on. And what Rabbi Sachs then notes is the most important part of this reading. The journey from is always easier than the journey to. As our ancestors fled, they did make mistakes. They turned to an idol and almost instantly feared the unknown. In the commotion and upheaval, they had lapses, but overwhelmingly They came together as one nation under God, Ke'ish echad belev echad, like a single person with a single heart. But in Bamidbar, as dreams suddenly start to feel more real, as the clouds obstructing the future begin to clear, as each of the people for the first time allow themselves to imagine a home for themselves in a land of their own, things begin to fissure. Unity, frays, rifts erupt. Petty jealousies that were suppressed by a common enemy are now unleashed. By mutual mistrust, the march to autonomy breeds more greed and suspicion than the rush to freedom. In the words of Rabbi Sachs, once more, the journey from is always easier than the journey to. And even though 10 weeks ago, it felt like communal decisions were riddled with difficulty. When should we close our shuls? How should we close our shuls? How could we close our shuls? And inevitably, as communities navigated these questions, differences between people came to the fore. But overwhelmingly, it was a sense of shared destiny that defined our response to the crisis. I think we all remember the extraordinary joint statement from the Orthodox rabbinic organizations about Pesach and safety. And yet, under these circumstances, it was always the case that the journey from was going to be easier than the journey to. And now, as rabbis and committees and communities maneuver through strategic haze and navigate halachic truths, the potential for division and suspicion and hostility is amplified and unbridled. As we find ourselves at the start of a march through the Midbar on the way back to our shuls, the possibilities of rupture and passion are all too real. So I ask this Shabbat, as we remain at home, let us remember that we are a people of tribes that through the lens of a census become whole. And remember that our banners and our flags in all their disparate hues face a single center and bespeak a single goal. Let us remember what holds us together. A devotion to God and to each other, a commitment to our mission and to recover the sparks of good that lace this world and dwell in the depths of every soul. And in that spirit, I wish you all a Shabbat of rest and health and peace and joy and calm. And I look forward to seeing you at Havdalah after Shabbat at 9:20. And please God, I look forward to seeing you in shul in person in the near future. Shabbat shalom to one and all. I will permit you now to unmute yourselves. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom, Rabbi.
Shalom, Rabbi.
Shabbat shalom, Rabbi.
Chodesh Tov.
Here's and Abe, welcome home, Abe, again. Good to see you.
Shabbat shalom.
Woman, you had a haircut? Theo, good Shabbos. Gezi, good Shabbos. Itzkowitz is good Shabbos. Debbie, good Shabbos.
Shabbat shalom, Rabbi.
Shabbos Chibi, good Shabbos. Good Shabbos. Good Shabbos. Michael Reichel, good to see you. Good Shabbos. Good Shabbos, those hiding. Good Shabbos, the Hurtans and Ellie Brown. Thank you for your
Shabbos,
text.
Rabbi.
Good Shabbos to you. Good Shabbos, Al. Good Shabbos, Linda. Thank you for your work. Good Shabbos, Sam. Good Shabbos, Silas. Good Shabbos, Lifters and Zapters. Good Shabbos.
Shalom. Chodesh Tov.
Jerry. Good Shabbos. Good Shabbos, Marty.
Yeah.
Good Shabbos, Laubers.
Shabbos, everybody.
And Rosenblums. And
Welcome to the community.
Shabbos,
Nobody hears you. Nobody knows it. But you don't know who it is.
Anybody? Oh, good Shabbos, Rosenbaum. Good to see you.
We're not watching now. We're going to make Shabbos now. Come on.
Did he finish?
Okay. Shabbos, one and all.
Shabbos, everybody. Rabbi.